All right, hello and welcome to MIT Sloan Alumni Online. We're pleased to have Professor Erin Kelly joining us today. To give our viewers a sense of the flow of today's session, we'll begin with an introduction, then a presentation by Professor Kelly, then move into the Q&A portion of the webinar. You may type your questions into the Q&A panel in the Zoom interface. This session is being recorded and we will be sure to share that and slides following the event. So let's get started. Erin Kelly is the Sloan Distinguished Professor of Work and Organization Studies at the MIT Sloan School of Management and core faculty in the Institute for Work and Employment Research. Her research has been published in many top sociology, management, and interdisciplinary journals, and twice recognized with the Rosabeth Moss Cantor Award, given for excellence in work-family research. Her new book with Phyllis Moen is titled Overload: How Good Jobs Went Bad and What We Can Do About It, and released just last month by Princeton University Press. Professor Kelly, we're grateful to have you with us today to share more about your research and your book. I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Greg. It's so great to be with you virtually. I wish that I could see your faces and connect with you in person, but we're all learning new ways of connecting and sharing information and ideas and dialogue these days. And I'm really pleased to be a part of this ongoing alumni conversation. So I'm going to share some ideas and highlights from my new book, as Greg mentioned, with just a couple comments about what we're learning from the COVID-19 crisis. And then I'm kind of assuming we're going to return to that topic in the Q&A. Overload was written with my longtime collaborator and friend, Phyllis Moen. And usually when I say we, I'm referring to the two of us as authors. But it was actually supported as part of a large interdisciplinary network that was funded by the NIH and the CDC and several foundations, as well as our own institutions. And I'm grateful to all of those collaborators, to the funders, and especially to the 1,000 employees and managers who participated in this ongoing study. So let me tell you about this study. And then, as I mentioned, I'm going to throw in a few COVID notes as we go along and hope that we have more time to talk about that at the end as well. So we partnered with the IT division of a Fortune 500 firm that we call Tomo. So Tomo is not like Google or Facebook, but it's a reputable employer with offices in mid-American cities mostly, as well as a global presence. It's considered a good place to work, but you shouldn't be thinking of the tech elite here. We studied professionals and managers, including software developers, analysts, project managers, quality assurance staff, and other technical experts. Of course, compared to the broader US workforce, these are highly educated and highly paid employees. And the firm has outsourced some of its IT work and created a global labor chain that I'll talk about a little bit, but it's the US employees who participated in our study. You may be interested to see that women are fairly well represented in these IT jobs and in IT management at this firm. So now that you have a little bit of a mental picture of the setting, I'm going to sketch our argument. We're arguing that work as it's currently configured isn't sustainable. Facing a global economy that has become more competitive, facing ramped up pressure from the market, employers and organizations often cut staff, move work offshore, look to automate processes, or do all three of those things. Now, there are good reasons to do this, of course, with regard to trimming labor costs, but what happens is that employees are asked to do more and more over and over with fewer and fewer resources. And so we argue that there are unrecognized costs of this current ramp up or speed up that will either break people or break organizations or both. So you may be aware that often conversations about the craziness of professional and managerial work are framed in terms of work-family or work-life balance. So the implicit message there is that mothers and some fathers and some other caregivers are finding it difficult to play by the regular rules of the game. And if we can, we should try to accommodate them when feasible. Our perspective in this book is quite different. We're arguing that the core concern for professionals and managers isn't how to balance work and family, but how to do all they're asked to do at work. In other words, the root problem is not the work family interface, but intensified work. And framing, understanding that overload is at the root, is the root issue, allows us to recognize that many employees, men, women, people of all stages, all life stages, including those with no pressing family responsibilities, are affected by the current situation. So after reframing the problem, we examine a potential solution. I'm not going to say it's a panacea or a magic bullet, but it's a positive and feasible change that helps organizations and teams address these concerns. We call this approach dual agenda work redesign, and some of you may recognize the phrase dual agenda from the path-breaking work of Professor Lottie Balin. While she was on the faculty here at MIT Sloan. She's now emerita. And we've built on those concepts and extended them for the current situation. As I said, we tested this solution in Tomo, this Fortune 500 firm, using a true field experiment and following about 1,000 study participants over time. We found exciting changes from the perspective of the company, as well as the perspective of employees and their families, and I'm going to dig into that in a minute. But before I do, I want to raise the question of how does this story of work redesign that I'm talking about connect with the fact that we've all redesigned our work on the fly in the last 2 months? And I'm going to argue that there are both similarities and differences, and I'm going to try to make some connections here that, again, we can elaborate on in the Q&A. So one thing we've learned is that remote work is feasible for many, many jobs. I always knew that, as one of the things that faculty enjoy is a great deal of control over when, where, and how they do their work. But we're seeing that is true for many professionals and also other workers who were previously not allowed to work from home. On the other hand, I would strongly suggest that this period isn't a fair test of changing work practices and isn't a fair test of what we get when we have extensive work from home or remote work options. Now that's because a sense of control is absolutely critical for getting the benefits that we see in our study that I'll tell you about in a few minutes. And we're in a moment where nobody feels that they had any choice or any control over the current situation. Secondly, remote work, when it works well, isn't all or nothing, but it's customized depending on both personal preferences and requirements of a specific role. And in fact, many of us are all at home or elsewhere, basically at home, all the time at this point, and we're not seeing kind of remote work all along the dial, but only at 100%. Thirdly, as you know, caregiving responsibilities are intensified right now. My kids are downstairs trying to do their remote learning. Many people are juggling real challenges on the family side. So even though I just told you that I am cautious about a work-family framing, when we understand the general problems of professionals and managers in the US and other developed countries these days, at this moment, we have acute work-family challenges. Another issue is that health concerns and economic worries are also a strain. And so if managers evaluate remote work based on what's happening right now, we've basically confounded our analysis to use social scientific terms, we've messed it all up because people are also facing these other challenges. So I would say that there's a real risk of increased burnout if we aren't deliberate in setting expectations at the moment and supporting time away from work. As you'll see, part of the path to overload is feeling that there's pressure to be always on, always connected to our devices, always monitoring whether there's a query from work. And in the current moment where we can't physically bound work and the rest of our lives, we are at risk of increasing both hours worked and the stress of work if we don't have deliberate times away from it. On the third hand, I think I've already said on the other hand, so I'll go back. Swinging back to the positive side, I do believe that this period can shake loose some old expectations about what's possible for people in different jobs. And we're also being reminded of the value of explicitly supporting each other and expressing our interest and care about people's personal lives and health. And those things could lay the groundwork for a more thoughtful approach to work redesign in the future. So what I've done is set up the story of the book, then jerked you into a reflection on the current moment. And now I'm going to ask you to put your head back into the period when we were doing the research, or any time you have lived through up until, say, February 2020. All right, so back to the study and what we learned from it. And then again, at the end, we'll flip back to lessons for today. So Phyllis and I came to understand the problem of overload through our interviews, observations, surveys, and other analysis in this Fortune 500 firm. And I'm going to start with the story of Randall. Randall was a software developer in his mid-40s, a single white man who had a bundled sense of energy. He had a trim beard. He'd recently purchased a Victorian house that he was excited to renovate. And he was active in playing sports, including an adult hockey league. But he was spending 50 to 70 hours a week working, leaving little time for those pursuits. And he shared that lately he'd been working in the office from 8:30 to 5:30, and then he was expected to be on a conference call from 8 p.m. to midnight most nights to discuss his current project. He viewed this as excessive and exhausting. He felt, quote, owned by the company and quite resentful of it. He recalls, and this is a quote, "There are times I would go home at 7 p.m. and purposefully take a nap when I knew I was going to be working from 9 to midnight. At that point, I lived for the company, you know. I didn't take that nap for me, I took it for them." Randall also told us an anecdote about going to the bathroom with his speakerphone on, thinking, quote, "You took up my life, what am I supposed to do?" So you can hear that he was angry, frustrated, and he recognized that he wasn't doing his best work or excited about contributing to the company at that point. We would say that Randall was experiencing overload. And we define that as the sense that there's too much asked of you and your team given your limited resources. This is actually a classic definition of stress. Too many demands, not enough resources such as time and staff to accomplish what is needed. And we identify 4 specific practices behind overload. First, long hours. Now, in this firm, hours average just under 50 hours a week for employees and around 50 hours for managers. And if you're thinking, that's not much, I'd invite you to notice that and think about the pervasive expectations of overload in many industries and settings. On top of the long hours, there was this pressure for always on availability, which I've mentioned. There's an expectation that you're quickly responsive to text or chats or phone messages or email, and that means there's little time fully away where you're unplugged and mentally recovering for the next day. We also saw a lot of multitasking and split attention. I'm going to take a wild guess and assume that some of you are multitasking and splitting attention at the moment. I know I have done that on some Zoom meetings in the last few weeks. But in this setting, in Tomo, what we saw was people would be on a call. Most meetings were happening via conference call or web meeting. But also monitoring chat, email. And so people expected that their colleagues were not actually fully on task and would do things like cue someone that in a minute we're going to turn to Leah's topic so that Leah knows she's supposed to start paying attention and get ready to re-engage. This also meant that during the day, people were overwhelmed with multiple things and information was coming in so quickly that they would often leave their strategizing or their technical work, what they saw as the heart of their work or their real work, for late at night or very early in the morning. And then in this firm, there was still an expectation of being visible in the office during the regular workday, even if you'd been on late night calls, in early morning meetings, or working weekends. Of course, many employees and managers in all kinds of firms, and not just at Tomo, are facing this situation. And part of the issue is that work is stretching across time and space, and yet many corporate cultures are still expecting this face time, this old school expectation that it's important to be visible to your boss and to others in the office. You may be wondering what led people to put up with this. Why did they go along with this pace? You may not be wondering that. You may be thinking, why have I done this over the last few years? In this case, it became clear that Tomo professionals and managers, the IT workforce we were studying, was scared of losing their jobs. So the firm had repeatedly reduced its US workforce, and the people we were interviewing had survived multiple rounds of layoffs and were now doing the work previously done by 3, 4, or even 10 coworkers. The company had also moved to a global labor strategy where more IT roles were performed in India and elsewhere. And so the need for global coordination prompted the 5 a.m. calls and the 11 p.m. check-ins to be sure that people in India and elsewhere had the information they needed to be productive during their workday. So that labor strategy both contributed directly to overload by adding new tasks and made it feel risky to push back on the unrealistic demands. We came to see that when everyone is running scared, it seems unwise to slow down to a brisk walk, even if you know your work would be better and your commitment to the firm would be sustained if you could dial it back just a little bit. Switching to the present moment just for a second, I'll also note that job insecurity has likely increased for many people at this moment of economic downturn, even people in professional and managerial jobs. And I recognize that raising questions about whether current work practices are sane and sustainable and smart for the firm is harder to do in the context of high job insecurity. Back to Tomo, thinking about what we learned from them, you may be wondering, why did they let us in? Well, top executives in the IT division and HR executives recognized that their employees were burning out, that they were losing people who had essential knowledge and skills and were really talented workers, and that it was becoming harder to recruit young workers in particular to this corporate culture where everyone was stressed. they did not initially recognize the real cost to the quality of work and to productivity, I would say. But as soon as we started interviewing the professionals and the frontline managers, we heard story after story about the concrete ways that the current practices were interfering with them doing their best work. So I've shared that burnout was present, and I've shared the story of one person, Randall. We talked to 25 teams early on and asked, given the way things are today, how do you feel? A big, broad question. People were able to come write whatever they wanted, and we kind of summarized the most prevalent answers here. So we have stressful, demanding, lots of meetings, frustrating. We do have some positively valenced words in green here. But one thing I want to call out is that this is not a work-family story primarily or only. Family pops up in these conversations, but the concerns are rising from the work demands and the work practices that people are experiencing. So we wanted to see whether we were able to take the employees in this setting and help them in some way, in a way that would also be good for the firm. So considering possible solutions, you may be thinking of flexible work arrangements as an obvious solution. But it turns out that flexible work arrangements, as most companies, at least in the US, have adopted them, are actually quite problematic. Often there will be an official policy allowing some people to make one of a set of changes, but access to these new work arrangements is individually negotiated. Phyllis calls this the mother may I system. And an employee needs to decide to ask to do something differently, and the manager usually has discretion to approve that or not. We call this model flexibility as accommodation because the new ways of working are understood to be accommodations, optional changes that you may decide to allow. But we know that when people do pursue those, they often face negative career consequences. And worries about this flexibility stigma, to use a term that other scholars have offered, keep some people from pursuing these arrangements, even if they would be helpful. And it's the case that women and moms are more likely to pursue flexibility policies despite the career consequences that they may fear. And so these often end up reinforcing gender inequality. So that's the reason we didn't want to just say, let's roll out a flexible work policy. Instead, what we did was bring an initiative that we called STAR to TOMO, and we see it as one example of a broader approach, this dual agenda work redesign approach. This approach is different in a couple critical ways. First, it's a collective process. Teams or whole departments go into STAR. So the work group is collectively and together reconsidering how they do their work, when and where they do their work. And this disrupts that dynamic of the mother may I singled out accommodations that we see to be problematic in other firms. So collective process is the first element that's distinctive. And the second element is the broad framing. STAR was described and was an effort to make work more effective, efficient, and sustainable for all employees, not as an attempt to deal with family concerns or women's concerns specifically. As we delivered STAR at TOMO, so this initiative that we're evaluating was rolled out with two components. First, teams or work groups went through participatory workshops where they discussed what are we doing now? How is it affecting us? What might we do differently? How would we coordinate in this new system? What if we assumed everyone had the ability to have more say over when, where, and how they did their work? How would we still get the work done, and how would we still feel like a team? There is also a component of manager training where managers often are in the situation where they believe themselves to be supportive of employees as whole people. They genuinely feel that, but that message is not being heard by the employees. And so this manager training was a reminder and a nudge to express support for people's personal and family lives, and to, as well as in their professional roles. As you can see, it's a multifaceted, somewhat complex change that's trying to rebuild the organizational culture for a given team, to change the rules of the game so that people are able to work in ways that work for them, but again, with the explicit intention of doing a good job on meeting the team's priorities. So did it work? I probably wouldn't be giving exactly this talk if it hadn't, but let me share how we evaluated that. We conducted a true field experiment, so a group randomized design in which 56 departments or work units were identified with the help of HR. We surveyed all of the employees and managers in those units, and then half of them were randomized to go through this workplace change, to go through STAR, and the other half continued operating with the usual company policies. So obviously, this allows us to make strong causal claims about what STAR did, because we know what people looked like at the beginning, and the two groups looked identical on all measured covariates or outcomes that we could identify. And then we were able to see how the two groups changed over time. And we did a total of 5 waves of survey data collection, and we were immersed in the firm. So we were doing qualitative interviews and observations throughout as well. Now there's one complication I need to mention. This study was, from my perspective as a social scientist, like a dream study to really have an opportunity to make strong claims about causality through this experimental method. But the experiment wasn't happening in the lab, it was happening in the real world, and other things happened too out in the real world. And in our case, the key issue was that a merger was announced, and in fact, this firm was acquired during the study period. So this was a publicly traded firm, and there was an acquisition, and of course, that throws everything up in the air in terms of whose policies are going to prevail, what's the leadership team going to look like going forward, and also, will I have my job after this acquisition is completed? So we needed to make some adjustments in terms of how we analyze the data to compare the people who went through STAR before with their counterparts who had been randomized to the control group before, and then separately compare the people who went through STAR later, knowing the merger was about to unfold, with their counterparts. So one way of assessing whether this worked was to ask whether people got on board. Did they accept this and make changes in their behavior? And we see changes in work at home, flexibility in schedule, new coordination practices, such as being more deliberate about meetings and about who attends meetings and determining how they can coordinate or communicate without meetings, as well as new communication practices. In this context, it had been considered unwise or actually not allowed to turn off your chat and turn off your email for some heads down time. And teams were now able to decide when and how they could help people actually do their real work during the workday. So you can see this was a shift in the culture, and a key part of that was the individuals were deciding when, where, and how they worked in consultation with their teams. So this involves both a shift in control or decision rights and expressions of support by managers and coworkers. So with this strong experimental design, we're able to show significant improvements on a number of dimensions. So employees feel they have more control or more choice over their work practices. They feel more supported by their managers. They report higher job satisfaction and increased family time. We also had changes, small changes in sleep measured through actigraphy watches, so measured objectively. And then on the right, you see decreases in work-life conflict, in stress, in in psychological distress, which is a precursor to more serious mental health problems. And we have a paper about to go under review that documents reductions in cardiometabolic risk over time. I mentioned my kids earlier, and as a parent of teens, I am also happy to report that changes in parents' work practices at Tomo crossed over or spilled over to benefit the teens in their household. We didn't study younger children, but we might expect that would be the case for younger children too. But for this children who were in our study, we saw that having a parent who had randomly been assigned to go through this initiative led to healthier sleep patterns and better emotional health. Now, of course, you may be interested in the benefits for the firm, and we find several of those. I mentioned job satisfaction, and also a key change was fewer voluntary exits in the 3 years after the launch. So there's a 40% difference between the turnover rate, the exit rate for voluntary exits from the STAR group as compared to the control group. And interestingly, that benefit was seen quite broadly. Because turnover is costly, of course, it's important to think about what are the savings from retaining experienced and talented employees. And using the company's figures on turnover costs plus the cost of what it would have taken for the firm to deliver STAR as we shared it with them, we estimate an ROI of about 1.6. Now, interestingly, we find no effects from our quantitative analysis on productivity, measured a number of different ways, but our interviews have many stories about the benefits for people's work effectiveness and their sense of their work quality. Given the time, I'm going to skip some questions on some interview responses from Randall, but he is the person that I opened with, and at the end, he was extremely pleased with how STAR had changed his experiences. We also interviewed Randall's boss, and he found that employees loved STAR and took it as a signal of trust from the firm. And he talked about the fact that this did involve working from home, but it was much broader than that. It was about changing the status quo and helping people think carefully and creatively about doing their best work. So in close, I'm going to say that we recognize that overload is the underlying issue, that a work-life framing has limitations, and it's important to think about what dual agenda work redesign could look like and could do for firms as well as employees. And this study provides strong evidence of a positive impact for employees and managers with very, very few differences by gender, age, or life stage, so broad benefits, also reaching employees' families, and benefits for the firm. So some implications for managers and leaders, and then I'll open up to questions. One thing that I'd like you to take away from this is that flexibility initiatives are not all the same. And when we have a narrow framing, we can end up reinforcing gender inequality. Secondly, you may be listening to this and thinking, this is just good management. I would agree, right? Work redesign is about being deliberate and thoughtful about how you do your work and how your team works together. It's completely feasible and worthwhile. The training materials that we used and studied in Tomo are freely available from the Work, Family, and Health Network website. And in our book, we also profile other work redesign initiatives and consultancies. And finally, even if you're not in a position to initiate a new program, like we saw with the work redesign initiative we studied, managers and employees can ask questions that help people rethink the status quo and move to better ways of working. I'm going to end there and open it up for questions and discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you, Professor Kelly. We now have some time for questions. So as a reminder to our viewers, you may type those in to the Q&A panel in the Zoom interface. And while you're doing that, we do want to mention that Professor Kelly will be doing a live Twitter chat on May 6th, next Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, hosted by the MIT Sloan Office of Media Relations. So if you're on Twitter, please join us for that, an opportunity to ask more questions and hear from Professor Kelly. So now for questions. Professor, to start us off, one of the things that I love in your book is that from the get-go, you're reframing the problem, and you talk about that in your presentation. Work-life balance is not the right thing to be thinking about. And so you and your co-author, Phyllis Moen, ask us to think differently about that. And that it's actually work itself that isn't working for a lot of people. So was this a gradual realization for you, or was there more of an epiphany moment as you were looking at the data?
So that's a great question. I would say that Phyllis and I identified as work-family scholars for a long time. And in fact, the NIH network through which this project was funded was called the Work, Family, and Health Network. And so we collectively understood the issue to be work-family challenges. Now, I had always emphasized that we should be paying attention to the work side of those work-family challenges, as well as the family side. But we long argued that, it doesn't help if you just get a little more organized about meal planning and, take better care of yourself. Really, it's probably going to have to be changes on the work side that are the issue. But we thought that the core problem was the work-family interface. So it was really spending time in Tomo and hearing all over and over from, frankly, middle-aged and older employees and the youngest employees in the workplace, recognizing that it was not just the parents who were frustrated and fed up, that led us to kind of broaden our understanding and start listening more carefully to the experience of overload.
Great, thank you. And I know that this topic has really resonated with our alumni, and a lot of folks have submitted questions to the effect of, what do you see as the underlying causes of overload? I know you mentioned long hours, et cetera.
Yeah, so I see the long hours and availability and multitasking as kind of the dimensions of overload. I think overload is occurring in many settings because of financial market pressure and because top executives are asked to trim labor cost without a medium-term or long-term perspective on how that actually puts the organization in a bind. So I do think in this case, it was the global labor strategy that was kind of driving, and the repeated downsizing that was driving people to feel the overload. But it may be somewhat different in different sectors. So you may be familiar, even before COVID, there was a lot of concern about physician burnout, right? So physician burnout is produced by both increased pressures to do things at a low cost and increased demands for seeing more patients that's facilitated by changes in technology, for example, electronic health records and new systems of tracking and documenting and knowing that you're monitored for that. So I would say that the big picture answer here is these are management strategies that are driving overload, and specifically decisions about whether to prioritize cutting labor costs or think about the implications of that and the downsides of running that lean and pushing that hard.
Great, thank you. One of the questions that has come in um, pertains to startups, maybe smaller, more lean organizations. What advice would you give a company in startup mode in order to establish a culture that is more supportive of their employees, maybe with a model like STAR or others?
Sure, that's a great question. I would say in startups, sometimes that fast pace is appreciated and valued, and there's a sense of excitement because you're part of something that is growing. But of course, there are costs to pushing people that hard, or to the experience of overload, even in a startup, because you're going to lose some people for whom it's just not feasible to work that way, and you're kind of encouraging celebrating activities and pace rather than celebrating, smart innovation and deep thinking. So I think some of the advice would be similar across the board, but in a startup, you might be able to do it less formally. So some of that advice includes just setting a clear message that you're focused on results and not on immediate responsiveness, right? So being clear that it's not about how quickly you respond to my text or how much you're on chat, it's about what you're doing. A second issue is helping people block time to collectively and individually think through what's the low value work that I'm doing. Sometimes we would hear employees talk about going to their managers and saying, these are the 6 priorities you've given me. What's the true top priority here? Or is there a way that we can share some of this work with others? Again, these are kind of core management tactics and, sound like good management, but it's about setting an expectation that we should be thoughtful about how much work we're doing and giving employees as much control as you can regarding when, where, and how they do their work.
Thank you. Professor, your book was written before the COVID crisis, but of course, there are so many lessons that we can take forward here, especially as many of our viewers, our alumni, are quite suddenly working from home, and we're all adjusting to this new normal. Could you share some thoughts on that?
Sure. Again, I would just first reiterate the point that I hope we're not taking the current moment as a fair test or a true test case for remote work at home. And so, like, kind of thinking out beyond this crisis, I hope that we don't snap back all the way to the current practices. But I hear part of the question is, what can we do now to make this more manageable? And again, I would say there are lessons from the STAR process, the work redesign process we had studied, including this kind of deliberate recognition that time offline is valuable time, both for our own health and well-being and for the work. So, recognizing that people need time away, and that partly is not rewarding that quick responsiveness. Offering employees lots of autonomy when it comes to when and where they do their work. In this moment, I would say it's also important to acknowledge that people have quite different needs at home, and to think about shifting expectations and shifting tasks within a team and over time periods, right? So we're not at a moment where we can push harder and think that's going to be productive. That's a clear path to burnout in my perspective. And so, I hear and I see in my own interactions a little more attention to the pets, the children, our health concerns, people's time for exercise and getting out into the world as much as you can. And I think that deliberately expressing our support for each other will pay off with both loyalty and commitment, and with people being able to do the best work that they can at this moment.
Thank you, Professor. Great advice. Now, switching gears a little bit, a question that came in. So while you found long-term cost savings for companies with the STAR program, how do you convince them to implement a work redesign if they are focusing more on the short-term revenue increases or the short-term ROI versus the long-term?
Yeah, that's an important question. I think that I don't have an answer to how to do this given that context. I think this is part of the evidence for how we need to change the broader corporate culture. And I recognize that is a big change and a big process. But I do think that it's important to ask leadership and expect leadership to fully investigate the costs of the current way of working before assuming that that's the most efficient path forward or most productive path forward. Also, I'll just mention very briefly, one source of pressure for firms is, of course, changing employment law and changing public policies. And COVID has laid bare the harsh realities of what many low-wage workers experience. It's not that COVID created all of those problems, but we see those problems more directly in this time. I'm talking about lack of paid sick leave, lack of paid family leave, unpredictable schedules that mean people don't know how many hours they're going to be asked to work in a given moment, and how that creates kind of this pressure to make yourself available for any shift that opens up or any additional hours that open up. I think we're likely at a moment when some of that is going to change. So as public policies reset the floor, then all kinds of employers, even those who rely mostly on professionals and managers, are going to have to make adjustments, both in what it takes for them to comply with the basic labor laws, and then what it's going to take to really distinguish themselves and attract the kind of employees they would like to.
Great, thank you. Switching gears again, one of the things you mentioned in your presentation with your research at Tomo and kind of being live in the field, the acquisition of the firm. I'm fascinated by this idea for you as a scientist, as a researcher. Take us back to that day when you found out that this was happening, and kind of what was going through your mind at that point.
Yeah, so I was not on site that day, but we had an embedded ethnographer. So we had people on our research team who had cubes and had badges and were on site running the study all of the time. And so they had company emails. So one of them received the email at the same time that there was the public announcement and called me to say, oh, you got to turn on the news. And, I, on the one hand, wasn't stunned because the firm had been struggling a bit at that point. And so the fact that this acquisition was going to unfold was not terribly surprising. But you're right. As a social scientist, I was panicked. We were halfway through the core 3 years of the study, and we just thought, okay, they're going to kick us out. In fact, the top IT executives decided that there was still a lot to learn from this study, even as they were much of their attention was pulled towards questions of how are we going to reorganize, who's going to keep their jobs, what's the leadership team going to look like, what's going to change with salaries, bonuses, and other policies. So we did get less attention from our research partners in the firm, but they also allowed us to stay through the whole entire planned study period, which I think was really wonderful of them, and I appreciate.
Thank you. Good persistence there, and a lot to learn as well. One other question related to this and the STAR project. Did you face any resistance from either middle management or employees during that implementation?
That's a great question. Middle managers are often kind of tarred with the brush of being resistant to change. In this setting and in this case, we found very little resistance to change because the middle managers were in pain as well, right? So, and they could see how the work quality of their teams was not what it once had been and not what these professionals really wanted it to be, because just the pace was so fast. Part of the reason that I think we were able to reassure managers about the concerns they did have was that these IT professionals were really well respected for their technical expertise. And so managers, turned to them and gave them a lot of autonomy with regard to how they did their work. So there is a little bit of an easier translation to, well, maybe then I shouldn't be monitoring who's in the office when, and how quickly someone's responding to my email. So managers tended to respond very well to the message that they could and should be coaches rather than hallway monitors, was a phrase that was used in the training. I will say that when questions were raised, they were largely about will this change survive the merger? And secondly, is having more control or say over how I do my work really going to help me with the amount of work that I have to do? And I think those were both savvy and smart questions that were raised along the way.
Great. Thank you, Professor. As we're nearing the top of the hour, maybe one last question. What's on the horizon for your research? And maybe what are you working on now that you're most excited about?
I love talking about that. On the research front, I'm involved in some projects trying to think about how we study the health impacts and the well-being impacts of work and how we connect that to organizational outcomes as well. I would say the single project that I'm most excited about is a collaboration with my colleague Hazir Ramandad and a PhD student, Alex Kowalski. And we are partnering with an e-commerce firm that delivers products to people's homes and businesses. So fulfillment centers, you can think of warehouses, but where people are picking objects and putting them in boxes to be mailed all over the country. And this organization recognizes that there's some issues with how they're setting up their schedules. And so they invited us in to learn from employees and managers, and then to look for feasible changes that we could make in scheduling and staffing practices that would benefit the employees who are lower wage workers, kind of moderate wage workers, as well as allow the company to meet its needs and get the products out as they have promised to their customers. So in some ways it's quite similar, but it's a very different setting, and it's in e-commerce, which of course is a growing industry and an important workforce to study both before and during and after the COVID crisis.
Great. Professor, we so appreciate your time, and we know you're tremendously busy, especially with the shift to online teaching this semester. We wish you all the best for the remainder of the term, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the questions and the great facilitation, Greg. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all of our viewers as well. Following this event, you should see a survey on your screen, so please fill that out and let us know your feedback on this session. We'll also send a follow-up email with a link to the recording. As always, you can reach out to us at Sloan Alumni online at mit.edu. Thanks for joining us today. Take care.